We're not talking about those small films or indie movies that failed at the box office but were great finds for those who discovered them. No, we're talking movies that, at the time of their release, were pretty popular and had solid, if not great, numbers at the box office. But, as we've learned with almost everything in pop culture, what was popular once can very easily be forgotten years later. So, the question remains, how many of these movies do you remember? And how many are remembered by today's audiences? Director Hal Needham. Stuntman Hal Needham made his directorial debut with this 1977 action comedy starring Burt Reynolds. The film spawned 2 sequels and it would have been the highest-grossing movie at the North American box office in 1977 if it hadn't been for a little film no one has forgotten called Star Wars. Director Roger Vadim. This classic 60s sci-fi flick starring Jane Fonda was the inspiration for the fembots in Austin Powers. Which begs the question, do you think we have to add Austin Powers to this list? Director Stan Dragoti. Written by John Hughes, Mr. Mom is a great comedy from the 80s starring Michael Keaton as a guy who loses his job as an automotive engineer and becomes a stay-at-home dad when his wife goes back to work. The film grossed $64 million on a $5 million budget and was the 9th highest-grossing film of 1983. Director Terry Gilliam. Robin Williams was nominated for 4 Academy Awards in his life. But while most film fans could name Good Morning, Vietnam, Dead Poets Society, and Good Will Hunting, there are no doubt many who have forgotten about his fabulous performance in Terry Gilliam's brilliant Holy Grail drama fantasy, The Fisher King. The film also picked up a Best Original Screenplay and Best Supporting Actress nomination, and a win in the latter. Director Robert Redford. Robert Redford's directorial debut is a powerful film about family tragedy and it made $90 million at the box office on just a $6 million budget. It also won the Best Picture Oscar, although, rather than being thought of as the best film of 1980, many movie fans only think of it as the film that undeservingly defeated Raging Bull. Director Arthur Hiller. We can divide those who remember Love Story from those who don't with one quote. Love means never having to say you're sorry, if you know you know. Director Roland Emmerich. This big-budget disaster movie had a huge marketing campaign and made almost $800 million at the box office. It wasn't very good, but lots of people saw it. Anyone remember? Director Hugh Wilson. Police Academy was one of the most successful comedies of the 80s and spawned a whole bunch of sequels. And, speaking of forgotten, the film's star, Steve Guttenberg, was one of the biggest movie stars of the 1980s. Ring any bells? And speaking of ringing bells, what 80s kid could ever forget Michael, the man of 10,000 sound effects, Winslow? Director Peter Feynman. When we watched the season 6 episode of The Simpsons, Bart vs. Australia, back in 1995, we all laughed at the Crocodile Dundee parody, Knifey Spoony, scene. Today, would anyone know what you're talking about if you said, that's not a knife, this is a knife? And on a side note, how many people remember that awesome Simpsons episode? Director Phil Carlson. There are some that might remember the 2004 mediocre Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson remake, but we're talking the 1973 original starring Joe Don Baker. The film did a respectable $40 million on a $500,000 budget, became a cult hit, and holds a 75% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. If you ever think of watching the 2004 film, stop and go check out the OGG version instead. Director Ron Howard. We mentioned Steve Guttenberg earlier, and this is another film he appeared in during his run as a top Hollywood star. Elderly people rejuvenated by aliens is the basic premise of this sci-fi comedy drama that was, as you may have noticed, directed by Ron Howard. Director George Roy Hill. If you're looking for caper movies, there is maybe no better choice than The Sting. Starring Paul Newman and Robert Redford, the film was a huge hit in the 70s and won 7 Oscars, including Best Picture. These days, we're not even sure if it's available on any of the major streaming platforms. Director Jim Abrahams. David Zucker, and Jerry Zucker. You don't remember Airplane? Surely you can't be serious? If you get the joke then, obviously you can't. Director Hal Needham. Having found success with Smokey and the Bandit the previous year, Hal Needham and Burt Reynolds teamed up again for Hooper in 1978, an ode to stuntmen and stuntwomen. Grease might have been the top-grossing movie that year, but Hooper wasn't too far behind at 6. In our collective memories, though, the latter lags way behind. Director: Bernardo Bertolucci. If you were asked what 1987 movie won the Academy Award for Best Picture, how many guesses would you need before you got to The Last Emperor? Director: Ron Underwood. Besides hosting the Oscars for an impressive 6 times in the 90s, and being one of the best to ever do it, Billy Crystal also had an impressive comedy run in the late 80s and early 90s, including the surprise hit City Slickers, which raked in almost $180 million. And, speaking of the Oscars, the movie provided one of the greatest Oscar show moments in history, the Jack Palance one-arm push-up. Director: Harold Ramis. Sticking with great Billy Crystal comedies from the 90s, how could we forget about Crystal and Robert De Niro in the mob boss and psychiatrist comedy Analyze This? Another box office hit, it led to the Analyze That sequel a few years later. Director: Adrian Lyne. As you might imagine, a movie about a very wealthy man who offers a not very wealthy man $1 million to sleep with his wife, and he accepts, got a whole lot of attention and talk back in 1993. It also made over $100 million at the box office and was part of the pop culture lexicon for years. But not anymore. Director: Leonard Nimoy. And once again we have Steve Guttenberg, this time, teaming up with 2 of the biggest TV stars of the 80s, Ted Danson and Tom Selleck, and A Baby. Not only was 3 Men and a Baby popular, it was the highest grossing film of the entire year in 1987. And did you notice that it was directed by Leonard Nimoy? Pretty cool, right? Director: George Lucas. There are those who know that George Lucas wrote and directed a film before Star Wars, and those that don't. In fact, he wrote and directed 2 films before Star Wars, but thanks 1138 wasn't the huge success that American Graffiti was. Director: Robert Zemeckis. This rom-com adventure was one of the highest-grossing films of the year in 1985, and its success was one of the reasons Robert Zemeckis was able to direct Back to the Future. Obviously, one of those films is much more remembered than the other one by the general audience. And let's stick with Robert Zemeckis here. Director: Robert Zemeckis. Zemeckis directed this movie starring Harrison Ford and Michelle Pfeiffer, and was the 10th highest-grossing film of 2000. The supernatural horror thriller obviously intrigued audiences at the turn of the century, but this one hasn't really stuck with us. Of those who remember this film, how many of you remember what the twist was? Director: Blake Edwards. This World War II submarine comedy wasn't just one of the top 3 highest-grossing movies of 1959, it was also the highest domestic grossing comedy of all time up to that point. Director: Peter Berg. Hancock, about an amnesiac and alcoholic superhero, struck box office gold in 2008, making over $600 million. However, less than 20 years later, and most folks are keeping the name of this Will Smith movie out of their mouths, because they don't remember it. Director: Mick Jackson. Sure, everyone knows the Whitney Houston song, I Will Always Love You, from the best-selling movie soundtrack of all time. But how many can say they really remember the movie, besides the scenes included in the song's music video? Director: Luc Besson. Still impressive in its pop style and production design, The Fifth Element was a big hit in '97. Luc Besson's sci-fi action movie gained quite a following and was much talked about and parodied at the time. Anyone seen it lately? Director: Michael Cimino. Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, and John Savage play the most iconic game of Russian roulette in cinematic history. Director: Steven Soderbergh. Steven Soderbergh became only the 3rd director in history to receive 2 Best Director Oscars in the same year, when he was nominated for Erin Brockovich in Traffic, for which he won the award. The crime drama was a critical and commercial success and a multiple Oscar winner. And yet, it doesn't get mentioned as much these days as it should be. Director: Orson Welles. While not very well received upon its release, Touch of Evil picked up steam in Europe, and by the 1970s, it was now being hailed in America as possibly Welles' second-best movie ever. It also features an opening 3.5-minute long crane shot that is spectacular. You might also think you remember the top movies of 1975? Let's see. 5 reasons why Batman Forever is the best of the Batman movies. What were the Oscar and Razzie winning movies the year you were born? Sources: 1, 2.